each time we experience beauty, in fact, we experience ourselves. We experience the essence of who we are. So the world, the phenomenal existence, is in fact the body of awareness. We literally live in the body of God, therefore as God, because there's no other, there's no agency, there's no intermediary. From Tantric point of view, renouncing the world is impossible even. Why? Because the world is Shakti. Prakasha is that quality of luminosity of Shiva. It's that what illumines everything. And Vimarsha, it's the reflective quality, self-reflective quality of Shiva as Shakti that throws its own luminosity back onto itself. We are already a living paradox. So it's not about solving that, but something else is hidden here that so many times I've witnessed how the baby has been thrown out in the name of some spiritual realization.
So today's episode is a deep dive, and it's been a long time coming. I have nearly waited 1 year to have this amazing conversation with one of my dear guides and teachers, Igor Kufayev. Igor is an author, an artist, and a spiritual teacher, teaching from the tradition of Kashmir Shaivism and Advaita Vedanta. What I also love about Igor is that he's an engaged spiritual teacher and is unapologetic when it comes to speaking his mind about the wars on the planet, the ecological destruction, and other challenges that humanity faces. And this, if I may say, is a rare quality that Igor possesses. So this conversation is a deep dive, and this is just the part one in which we talk about topics such as beauty as a path to transformation, particularly referencing his beautiful book, Chamatkara, The Hidden Path of Beauty, which I could not recommend more. And we also talk about the esoteric topic of Spanda in Kashmir Shaivism, Ascent and Descent as in Descent of Grace, and the rise of power or Kundalini. So this is a really rich conversation as Igor draws upon the insights of multiple traditions for these often intricate and difficult subjects. And lastly, Igor is making a trip to the United States in September, so feel free to check out the links to his immersion in the show notes below. So I hope that you will join this conversation, and if you like it, please share it with your friends, and thank you.
Okay, Bismillah. Well, konnichiwa. So good to see you, Igor. We'll be diving deep today, and thank you so much, Igor, for this opportunity and sharing this space with me today. Thank you.
Greetings, and I'm very, very thrilled to be here. It's been long in the planning, so I knew about this beautiful venture that you have started some times ago. And so I'm really, really with no expectations, but very much looking forward to whatever might unfold.
Yes, thank you. I've been looking forward to it and so glad that this is finally taking place. We could perhaps dive in. I had the opportunity from our podcast conversation. We were talking about some very interesting things, which included the tantras and this idea of ascent and descent. And I was really, really enjoying that because that has become a very important part of my journey, also in relation to the project potential paradigms that I've been doing, and essentially how I'm sort of living my life right now. So we stopped on that note, and then I actually started to read your wonderful book called Chamatkara, which is an interesting word. So I have a lot of questions, and what I felt was that it was sort of apt and appropriate to come to this book because it really distills. It's a distillation of your own experience and really goes into many deep ideas such as possession by the goddess and the path of beauty, and this mystical idea of Spanda in Kashmir Shaivism, which is related to the prompt that we stopped at the last time, which was ascent and descent. So just to say that you being an artist, I really appreciated the piece of art that this book is, also at the physical level. The texture, the color, the perfume. I don't know if that was intentional, but even the smell of the perfume of the page. Um, yeah, so maybe that's one good place to begin. And also that I'm a student of Kashmir Shaivism, and it was a joy to read the book because although I feel like it's not a big book, it's a very deep. It covers so much territory. So I pause there, and maybe we can begin at what inspired you to write this book.
Book wasn't really written as a lot of books come to light. It was rather a kind of a gradual assimilation of various discourses into potential book. So the whole project took place over many years. And it was also simultaneously accompanied by some other potential material that could have been turned into a book, which I thought would be more appropriate, something a bit more substantial in volume, in also resolve. But there was this sudden moment of um, intimate revelation that I went through. And I felt, since I've never really authored any books and being a visual artist most of my life and kind of launching myself as an author, I felt the most honest thing would be is to really give the distilled sense of what it means to be the love of beauty, what it means to experience this reality through the senses, and what it takes and what is taking place behind the scenes of that seemingly obvious affair. After all, there is also in spiritual discourses, there is this allusion to the machination of uh, all that what perception is known for. Many spiritual teachers of the past and present speak of this in terms of the conglomerate, a machine of sorts. In fact, references are made like that, were made like that by some very notorious teachers of our time. And yet, what I felt also, and this is, of course, was a synthesis of what I have always intuitively sensed without perhaps cognizing it fully, and what I gotten to know directly. So that confluence of my life as an artist, which is inseparable from my childhood, I could say that I've embarked on the path of a professional artist as early as the age of 12. I was given to the studio, private studio, to someone who became my mentor and then continued my studies. So the identity of being an artist whilst growing up psychologically was so fused that it was impossible to pull them apart. It was never considered a profession, a job, uh, doing something. It was just a matter of fact, living it. And yet, with the dramatic changes around my mid-30s, when profound force took me over, and perhaps we can go back to it during the course of our conversation, there was a hold to that activity of an artist. In other words, the activity of actually producing works of art, painting, drawing, creating something. And after many years of integration, I've realized that the impulse to paint was no longer there. And instead, I went to become a kind of instrument of what this whole thing as teaching spirituality is about. And then inevitably, I've soon found out that the two intimately relate. So the Chamatkara as a book could be seen as that synthesis, paying respect, paying tribute to that what the entire life was dedicated to prior to this moment, whilst also an attempt at the very same time to reconcile seemingly impossible, to reconcile what I don't want to say was given to an exhaustive discourse or discourses, but rather giving some taste to what one can only experience within oneself. So in other words, it's not a book in that sense that one reads from cover to cover. I don't know what's your experience, but because it was assembled to begin with from the discourses delivered over a period of 2 to 3 years, and then that tossing and turning began when chunks were removed, transcribed, adopted for written language, expanded, and the final kind of sitting down and really raking through this and realizing that the book should have this emphasis. So a lot more was removed. So it slimmed down and became more of a allusions, insights, this perhaps, if I may say, giving that sense through the fragrance between the words and what some of the passages may invoke in the reader. Yes, it also has in the earlier part of the book some of the foundational grounds of tantric teaching, because it would have been very difficult, nearly impossible, to delve into that what is often referred by scholars of Tantric Shaivism, which how it is referred to in the scholarly circles. The Kashmir Shaivism is more of a populistic term. That creme de la creme of the Kashmir Shaiva teaching, which is exalted by some of the key masters of that tradition. So in order to speak to that, of course, some foundational ground had to be covered. So therefore, in Prakasha and Vimarsha, right, the aspects of where the Tantra really begins, the awareness and the reflective power of self-awareness, and the Spanda, that the quiver, the throb at the heart of Shiva, as with that poetic reference. So, and then of course, once that ground is covered, it was a sheer joy just to touch up on these aspects in the theory of rasas, the rasavada, and effectively speaking, reposition the reader, hopefully, potentially, into reevaluating what actually going on behind the scenes when we experience something, anything, but particularly rehabilitating the value of emotions as the theory of rasavada. And of course, that's why it was impossible to not to bring that the foundational ground of all classical Indian arts in the Bharata Muni's treatise, right? So that it was, which laid the foundations for all classical Indian arts to this day, plays tremendous role, tremendous importance. So that's what this book really is about. And so it wasn't really attempt to come up with the first book. It was more like a kind of a paying tribute, giving it due in that synthesis of everything that I have known prior to the moment of putting it all under the cover. And of course, it's a collective work as well. Our whole team worked on this. So,
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that background of the book. My experience was really being also a student of Kashmir Shaivism and Sufism to come to this book was really synthesis. I really enjoyed that, it being not a very, in terms of the weight of the book, it's not a heavy book, but as I was reading through, I was in awe of the how you were connecting the dots, starting from describing this hidden path, which is also one of the chapters in the book, um, of beauty as a hidden path. And I think what's really valuable, at least to me as a reader, is you being an artist from very early on, as you were sharing, and also a spiritual adept, the combination of those two. And there are many, many deep subjects that you traverse in that, with reference to Kashmir Shaivism in particular. And I think the readers, I highly recommend this because people often yearn, with the, as you were saying, the Shastras that Abhinavagupta talks about, music, art, and the path of, and this particular path of beauty and art. And what is the connection, often is mysterious. What is the connection of that to our spiritual journey? So this book is incredible to actually synthesize that, and also to draw those parallels. Um, and it's very approachable. So really, thank you for bringing this forth.
Yeah, it was a
Um,
great, yes, yes, yes.
mhm. I will also have to reread this. This is one of the things that I noticed, that many of the passages invoke something deep within, and I personally felt that I would have to imbibe in it and marinate. Um, Particularly for me, when you speak of creativity becoming not just as an artist, but the human incarnation being, providing that opportunity for being an artist by birth, or the purpose of our life being creativity. And how does that connect with the psyche? I could go on and on, but just very appreciative of it. And maybe we can dive in to beauty as the path. Um, I don't know if you mentioned the Sufi quote in the book, but the quote goes something like, God is beautiful and he loves beauty.
It's in the Hadith, yes.
It's in the hadith.
Yes,
Yes.
it's yes, of course, variously translated, but in essence, God is beautiful and he loves beauty. Sometimes he is abbreviated because it poses some a difficulty in understanding why it's being genderized, but um, that in fact line was a great candidate to be used as one of the uh, poetic entrances, references in the book, but I've excluded it simply because it was used in some other essays on the topic. And perhaps it would be worth mentioning something so that those who are potentially um, hearing this conversation can feel more connected to why do we even speak about this, and why the beauty here needs any rehabilitation, and why the beauty is considered to be here and spoken of as that hidden path. If you recall at the beginning of the book, in the introductory parts, there is this very brief outline, like literally streamlined outline, which begins with the Dostoevsky's metaphysical um, mentioning of the Trinity, the importance of that Trinity, the truth, beauty, and justice, that obviously wasn't invented by Dostoevsky. This is incorporated into his work richly from Christian theologians, and very much felt to me in line and analogous to what in Vedic tradition is spoken of as that Satyam, Sundaram, and Shivam, or could be said in different order, Shivam, Satyam, Sundaram, that trinity, that what stands here for, effectively speaking, almost on par with the same categories of what is exemplified in that truth as Sat, Satyam, in justice. Perhaps he is replaced with Shivam as that auspiciousness of the Godhead. And Sundaram, adjective in Sanskrit as which stands for beautiful, beauty. And what of tremendous significance is the correlation between the experience of beauty and that, again, Vedic Chit Ananda concept. That whenever any spiritual teacher today or yesterday, it doesn't matter how radically, let's say, oriented their teaching, everything can be reduced to nothing. Everything can be reduced to, let's say, awareness. Awareness is the one and the only, this real substratum, the alpha and omega. And yet, there is also undisputable understanding among all teachers. It's like kind of an unspoken agreement. Though beyond all qualities, absolute also is known to be Sat, Chit, and Ananda. So it's known to be as being, consciousness, bliss. And whilst the first two, being and consciousness, is not open to all, being is unreachable, abstract concept. Even though we all live being, and being is what is given, being is what gives and imbibes everything with the vitality of what we call this life. It is inaccessible. It's not accessible through the senses. It's not accessible through the mind. It's not accessible through any psychic parameters or dimensions. So being, as it were, as Maharishi Mahesh Yogi used to say, would have remained forever undiscovered, abstracted from reality, if not for the fact that consciousness here, that what stands for Chit, the fact that we are all conscious. So the consciousness rescues being. And that what brings tremendous joy, that what brings that Ananda. So now, putting this now together in juxtaposing it with the aforementioned Shivam, Satyam, Sundaram, or Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram, Ananda here stands for what is tangibly experienced by every human being, irrespective of their level of consciousness. So in other words, if being is inaccessible and forever abstract, and the only access to being is through the fact that we are conscious. So being conscious gives us that taste, but that does not mean we taste being, because being here tastes itself. Through the fact that we are conscious, this is where spoken of in terms of being rescued through the fact that it is conscious of itself. Yet that experience is not granted to the majority of people. It is a dim, supreme, secret, and rare, in fact, among those who have walked the path and dedicated themselves. And there's no need to really be shy about this and speak about it in somehow uh, preferred democratized way. Whereas beauty, as expression of Ananda, is available to absolutely everyone. So in a way here, that perspective, this is what I wanted to allude with this little book, is the beauty here, the experience of beauty is where direct access to our essence is given at any moment in time. So therefore, the argument is being made in the book, the proposition, the supposition, the suggestion, the invitation, that each time we experience beauty, in fact, we experience ourselves. We experience the essence of who we are. So therefore, it's immediately available, the most democratic, the most available to all experience. And yet it goes unnoticed because by beauty we understand a lot of things, and we confuse preferences, and we confuse acquired tastes and so forth with what otherwise beauty here stands for, because I felt also it was important to give dramatic examples of experience of beauty when we stand stripped naked in front of the display of the power of nature in whatever way, which basically strips us bare of all the coverings there and then. So this is the most direct experience of beauty. Whether this is as dramatic as cataclysmic event, or as seasonal as being holding witness to a powerful thunderstorm, a stupendous vistas that opens up somewhere, mountainscape, landscape, seascape, the dunes of the desert. These are direct when we are put in touch directly with the essence of who we are through this shortcut into the nature of experience, where literally that circuit is closed. So we could also say that the attempt of this book is also to rehabilitate the quality of what beauty stands for from otherwise industrious use of that term in our day and age.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you for that very clear exposition. I am also um, beginning to, for some time, call myself an etymologist because I've fallen in love with etymology. And so, yeah, thank you for that very clear exposition of Satchit and Ananda, um, and then connecting it with what beauty is and why it is accessible to everyone. And here there are two sort of questions that come to my mind, or two prompts that we can take as paths. And one of them is, you were earlier talking about as you were talking about Satchit and Ananda, or Satyam Shivam Sundaram, being and our quality of being conscious, that being is being rescued. And I'm wondering if this is related to Prakasha and Vimarsha. Um, and then, of course, Vimarsha being connected to the possibility of having a creation. That is the first direction to consider Vedanta and its connection to Tantra. And you mentioned some of that in the book. And the second perhaps would be as beauty and the refinement of perception, that is a thread that you address in the book. So maybe we can begin with, would you say that Vedanta, in my understanding, studying Advaita Vedanta, that there was an emphasis on being, and that Tantra then takes you from towards Vimarsha, towards the bliss, and not just resting in being, but projecting you into creation. So I was wondering if you would like to say something about what do you feel is the connection between these two ancient traditions?
Well, philosophically speaking, of course, there is a tremendous difference because there is a departure made. And that departure is due to the emphasis, or rather, the emphasis due to the what can be as a proper means for, let's say, attainment. So Advaita Vedanta's emphasis is on renunciation, one way or another. We know this to be the path of renunciation. In fact, it's a path of renunciation par excellence, because Advaita Vedanta leaves no stone unturned when it comes to the juxtaposition of the world in relation to Brahman. So that, that coveted, much spoken of equation, the world is unreal, only Brahman is real, Brahman is the world. Here in Advaita Vedanta, indeed installs the supremacy of being, as Brahman here exemplifies, and the world is given the place of appearance only. And for a reason, because on the path of the renunciate, there needs to be a strong psychological conviction to leave behind this world of worldly attachments. Because if that is not achieved, then one would always be left with very undesirable dilemmas with regard to the goal is set. So philosophically speaking, of course, these systems are complete and supreme, each in their own right, each in their own way. But in terms of, let's say, application, this is where it's very important to draw the distinction, because the Tantra, the non-dual Tantra in particular, because it views the world not as an appearance in awareness, not even as a reflection of awareness, as, let's say, in the theory of bimba pratibimba, to which we can maybe return if there is a need, that the analogy of the mirror, the analogy of the reflection. But Tantra proper speaks of the world as an embodiment of awareness. So the world, the phenomenal existence, is in fact the body of awareness. So the world is therefore addressed and spoken of and referred to as the body of Shiva. So it's, if we are to use that more kind of a Western vocabulary, that even if we lean towards that religious language, we literally live in the body of God. And we live in the body of God, therefore, as God, because there's no other, there's no agency, there's no intermediary. So, of course, this may be highly blasphemous when it is spoken from the point of view of religious perspective and understanding. But that's exactly what many mystics of various respective traditions have alluded to. Some more directly, others in more poetic and metaphorical ways. So when we speak of the Advaita Tantra, which is kind of an invented term, I don't want to take credit for it, but we came up with that some 10 years ago for one of the science and non-duality conferences, where I simply thought, well, Advaita Vedanta is being everywhere. Why don't we just add Advaita Tantra? So ever since it got kind of like in circulation, and we kept it in in our own biographies and CVs. So from the point of view of Advaita Tantra, that relationship that prior to that was irreconcilable, the relationship between that and this, that what is exemplified by the Upanishadic verse, Purnamada Purnamidam, Purnat Purnam Udachyate, Purnasya Purnamadaya, Purnat Purnam Iva Vashishyate. So that absolute is full. This relative is full. From fullness, fullness comes into being. By fullness, it is sustained, and into fullness, it is being reabsorbed. What remains is fullness. So this relationship of the early Upanishad has been reinstated in very unapologetic terms by Kashmir Shaiva sages circa 10th century, and before that, 8th to maybe 11th century, when some of the key figures of that tradition lived and walked the earth. So these postulates came very strongly through the Shiva aphorisms, the Shiva sutras, through Spanda Karika, the authoritative text on the theory of vibration. And of course, with many other work, Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, whatever there are, there are many scriptures but the principal ones speak of the indivisible reality of the absolute and the relative. So you've started your inquiry with the terms Prakasha and Vimarsha, which had to make their way into the Chamatkara book at the beginning so as to orient the reader. And of course, all Tantra begins, you cannot study Tantra unless you go straight into this dyadic relationship. And that dyadic relationship exemplified by the union of Shiva Shakti. And that union of Shiva Shakti here is exemplified by Prakasha and Vimarsha. Prakasha is that quality of luminosity of Shiva. It's that what illumines everything. And Vimarsha, it's the reflective quality, self-reflective quality of Shiva as Shakti that throws its own luminosity back onto itself. So it's an act of self-awareness. So in other words, this is, to me, felt immediately much more precise relationship than, let's say, how back in the days in the non-dual circles, in New Advaita, awareness was spoken of only as one and the only reality. And how does this experience then relates to awareness, or how does awareness relates to this experience, was kind of given a smoky veiled view. Whereas in this relationship, exemplified by Prakasha and Vimarsha, often I do this in the retreats by drawing that 8 of the infinity lying on its side, right? That shape. So it's awareness and the power of self-awareness, or luminosity and the power of reflecting that luminosity back onto itself. So it's 2 in 1 and 1 in 2. It's not that one gives rise to 2 and that what is given rise to becomes inferior. But the relationship here of Shiva and Shakti, speaking in tantric terms, is paradoxical in a sense that the dichotomy of the mind can have insights to that and direct experience of that. But to understand that, of course, it's a very difficult thing to do, because this is where a lot of people stumble, that they somehow feel, well, that's duality. What is then prior to? What is superior? Well, nothing is prior to, because this relationship of self-sustaining, or another way of speaking about it, all experiences are with reference to the self. So in other words, the very quality of what is is being experienced is experienced in the first place on the account of with reference to the self. So therefore, every experience is self-referral, not object referral. So this is in a way the very first steps in understanding how Tantra, philosophy, metaphysical understanding, and utilizing the Tantric teaching into one's daily life, because that's what it boils down to, because it proposes very different philosophical outlet for a householder, as opposed to the renunciate, for whom the Advaita Vedanta becomes that very, very guiding light, which helps to renounce the world. From Tantric point of view, renouncing the world is impossible even. Why? Because the world is Shakti. So the renunciation of the world in itself is considered to be a kind of oxymoron. Traditionally, of course, it doesn't necessarily mean so in strict terms, because of course there are many tantrika sects, there were nuts, and there were many, many different yogis, and where tantric teachings who were, ascetics who walked out of life, walked out on social strata of interactions into that asceticism. But it does not mean that it somehow creates the exposes, it doesn't mean that that exposes some holes in the philosophy itself. So therefore, the Kashmir Shaivism here comes at a great, very timely in a way as a philosophy itself. Timely back then, when it reappeared on the landscape of India, and timely today, now in our time, because this philosophy reinstalls the importance of this, what we consider to be this embodiment, this world, this life, these interactions, these relationships.
Yeah. May I ask you to repeat a sentence? So, were you saying that there are claims made to hold in the philosophy of Tantra?
No, what I meant is that even though non-dual Tantra, with this, what we just spoke about, meant to be a guiding light for the householder life, there are, of course, a lot of examples one can find there and then where tantric philosophy is being utilized by ascetics, by those who walked out on a social arrangements, who walked out on social interaction as it is known for in terms of the conventional forms of interaction. That doesn't mean that this shows holes in the philosophy itself. It's simply how it is applied. What I wanted to rather to highlight is that Kashmir Shaivism in particular gained its reputation for being known as the householder philosophy par excellence. So if the Advaita Vedanta is the greatest philosophy for renunciate, then the Kashmir Shaivism likewise is the greatest philosophical system of thought for a householder, because it constantly reaffirms what it means to be in a body, what it means to be in a relationship with someone in particular, because everything mimics here. In Tantra, there are continued mimicking of all this relationship that can be traced to that matrix woven out of these vowels and consonants of Shiva and Shakti. So that whole shimmering sound that the universe is as reverberating whole is, in a way, throughout its entire fabric, as awareness made manifest, reenacts itself in every human interaction, in every human drama, at a collective level, at an individual level, at the level of a tribe, family, nation. So every relationship here is a reflection of that. So this is, of course, this, in my understanding, brings tremendous confidence back into our experiences rather than living in that kind of shrouded in the mystery of vagueness of why this life, what this life, what's the purpose of this life. At the time when so many authorities, so many ideologies crumble down. See that the Kashmir, because Kashmir Shaivism, if we are to speak in kind of down-to-earth plain language, is known for being very practical, down-to-earth, monistic realism. No, monistic idealism, not realism, but could be also turned around and called realism. But what it means is that it's a very practical philosophy, very applicable to daily life. But whereas it's questionable if Advaita Tantra is applicable to daily life unless one walked out on life.
You meant Advaita Vedanta, right?
Yes.
Yes. Wow, amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for this clear transmission. Many things come to mind. I love how you said the body of awareness, creation as the body of awareness. And I know that in Kashmir Shaivism, as you were referring to the vowels and consonants, the state of internal samadhi uh, without it pervading into creation is related to certain set of vowels and is not considered as a realization in Kashmir Shaivism, which would be a very, internal state, which did not pervade into the external. And you also talk about it, maybe that's a theme we'll touch on, where you talk about samavesha versus samadhi, which would be really great to dive into. You were also talking about this paradoxical connection between the one to many. And in my own journey and in the wider spiritual circles out there, I noticed that we have this tendency of wanting to pick one or the other. We have to reject the many to somehow prove that there is unity. But as you were also showing with your gesture of the infinity symbol or the Mobius strip, that it is a paradoxical, and it's both in a way, awareness along with the body. I just love it how you give a physical body to awareness. Because otherwise, I feel it becomes an abstraction. Awareness becomes somewhere extracted out there in the mental sphere. So, would you say that this paradox needs any resolution? Where I find myself sometimes is that I don't need to resolve paradox and just let the paradox do what it needs to do.
The whole point of the paradox that it doesn't require resolution, because paradox is not a riddle to be solved. In fact, solving of the riddle is dangerous. If we are to bring the analogy of Oedipus Rex, that first most dramatic and tragic of all the Greek tragedies that the story of Oedipus exemplifies, with which all unrolled from the moment of him resolving that riddle, which caused the Sphinx to throw herself off the cliff, and him leaving then all that what unveiled itself as a destiny. So I don't want to go into the mythology of that, on the psychology rather of that, what Oedipus exemplifies here, because the Oedipus suffered this complexity of human drama brought to extreme. And maybe to the listeners, those who are not familiar with the story of Oedipus, uh, which one of the early plays of Greek theater, but it's based on the character that was basically son of the king and brought out in a very different family. And at some point, he wants to discover who his real parents are, sets on the road of discovery, leaving his foster parents. And on a way to find out who his real parents are, he meets his father in a chariot, and being confronted, he kills his father. Then, after some journey, he arrives to a place where the queen is being widowed because someone killed her husband, who was a king. She receives him as a guest and that fosters an amorous relationship between the two. So as the listener can guess, this happened to be Oedipus entering the affair, incestuous affair with his mother, not knowing that. And when he finds out what happened, of course, this leads to a dramatic death of his mother, the queen, who hangs herself, and he takes his sight off. He blinds himself. And blinded, he then, given that prophecy to wander until he reaches the place where people don't know what the roaring, the roaring, what this ore is. So in other words, people who don't know what the sea is. So in the Mediterranean myth, of course, this is very, very difficult place to find because it's all around the seas. So, but this is the domain of the psyche, domain of the psyche. So the paradox here, represented by the riddle of the Sphinx, and so solving the paradox here does not necessarily makes us happier. So maybe that a long allusion that I gave with this the most dramatic of all the Greek plays, which set forth this kind of like ultimate sense of how we can be on a road to destiny, to find our origins, which leads to this, in the case of Oedipus Rex, incest and the killing of the father. And Jim Morrison was obsessed with the story, and we know that was incorporated into his famous or infamous song, The End, where that Jungian psychology also was given, right? So why am I speaking about this? Kind of not to confuse, not to lose the listeners now. But because you've asked, is it about solving the paradox? And the paradox here that we all live, our life is already a paradox. But it's not about solving that paradox. This is where maybe a lot of folks in spiritual circles, when they embark on a journey, they somehow misplace the understanding of what this is all really boils down to. What is this all about? And so the seeking becomes that solving the riddle of the Sphinx. So many talks these days in that cross-pollinated territory of New Age and all these psychic powers, where we talk about our collective destiny, individual destiny. Are we better off knowing? Are we better off knowing exactly how and in what way do we relate and connect to each other? You see? So this invisible karmic interactions that brings us together, better to remain for what they are, to be experienced in this lifetime, People go and find out. I want to know who I was in my previous life. I want to know who my wife, who my children, what is the connection? And the emphasis goes there. Are you sure you want to really know? So in the same way, this analogy, one needs to understand what is the true purpose of spiritual enterprise, spiritual seeking. Because finding ultimately the answer of who we are can be a devastating experience. Devastating experience. And this devastating experience also can lead to a variety of side effects that would make one literally lose the plot of why one is alive and what one is to do here. We know this to be true. I have seen it and witnessed myself, in myself, the rise of these tendencies, how they play out, and in those in my immediate surrounding when I, even before I ventured to hold space and to guide others, I have witnessed that with fellow finders, with fellow very gifted, very talented, and those who took the bull by the horn, and how it all, in many cases, played itself out quite dramatically. So, no, it's not about resolving the paradox. We are already a living paradox. So, it's not about solving that, but something else is hidden here. And that's what, in a way, the attempt through Chamatkara was, is to reintroduce that thread there, bring it back into the conversation. That so many times I've witnessed how the baby has been thrown out with the bathtub in the name of some spiritual realization. You see, so it's like, this is why you greeted me with konnichiwa, and why I've always been very intuitively drawn to traditions and cultures where spirituality and spiritual inheritance intertwined and interwoven into the fabric of the culture to such degree that you cannot tell them apart. You cannot separate them. So when it comes to Japanese culture in particular, it's a unique culture. All cultures are unique, we could say. But there are these aspects which takes experience itself to the level of pure art, to the level of gesture, performance, even when nobody's watching. In fact, not even. There's no need for anyone, because there's no need for the audience. The gestural aspect in the way the tea is prepared, the personal practice with the bokan or katana, the personal practice in terms of how one carries one's self in any given situation, has this kind of steeped in deep traditional understanding, that concept of ma, concept of space in Japanese culture. The space that is impossible to translate into English language. I don't know what other languages are there that operates with this concept, but certainly it falls flat on the ears when we start to give it an explanation of what ma means. It's a space. It's a space. It's a space of the bow of respect. It's a space left when something is arranged as a flower. It's a space left for when one is sitting down, so that there is this, everything that carries that concept. It's the most known concept in Japanese culture, and at the very same time, the most elusive one. One cannot teach ma. One can only know ma. So in a way, this is what the paradox of being alive is, because we are already that, an expression of being. So therefore, philosophy here is not to bleach something, sterilize experience from what otherwise would hide the God Almighty from its view. No, contrary to that, it is through this, that we can constantly reascertain that connection. And this is what, to me personally, deeply attracted in the teaching of Kashmir Shaivism, particularly as I went into some of these aspects which simply gave me exhilarating insights into what was always known, but known without being fully cognizing it, even when those insights were aplenty in the creative process, or in the process of that creative agony when everything seems to be slipping away, and when that uncertainty has to be not just befriended, uncertainty has to become a principle of life in order to create. If one leans on certainty, then maybe you can build a brick wall with certainty. But even the wall in Japanese culture has this aspect of beauty. It lingers and articulates the space rather than divides it. It's multifunctional. That wall serves during the peaceful times as what articulates the space, gives plenty of nooks and crannies for this or that activity. It blends with the landscape and gives that sense of continuity of nature into life. As you know, in Japanese art, nature is constantly worked with and from, not against. In times of the war, that wall becomes the fortification. It becomes the fort. It becomes the defense system. And so that it's not defined permanently. It's undefinable. It defies the language. It's always in accord to what is being experienced in a given moment in time. So in a way, to me, this is something that maybe one of the very important phase in spiritual endeavor of any sincere aspirant, any sincere seeker or finder, is to really somehow arrive to this understanding, and sooner better, so that not to kind of like let the life to pass by in idle kind of speculation of trying to outsmart that what already beautifully playing itself out here on our behalf.
Yes. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah, thank you. And I like how your approach is unapologetic. It has helped me in my own journey to being at that phase where I found myself wanting to resolve this paradox and then eventually also separating myself rather painfully from friends and communities where it becomes like an echo chamber where the paradox is resolved, but deep within myself, I knew it wasn't. And that journey of iterations of becoming more and more comfortable that there is no need to resolve that paradox, but live it. It seems like it's a spiral that I feel like embodying that fullness that you were speaking of, the fullness from one side of that loop and bringing it into the constantly, consistently continue to bring it back. And I felt that your approach was very helpful to just kick me into into the outer realm, into creation, and to live a creative life. And that is, I find myself 2 or 3 years ago to finally take the plunge fully into the unknown, and making an inner vow, an inner commitment to creativity, the creative process applied to life, not to a creative art. Um, One of the Sufi quotes that got triggered in me with what you just shared is that the journey to God has an end, but the journey in God has no end. And I often refer to that internally to remind myself of this journey. And I also liked how you at one point said realism and idealism, and then you said that you could replace one with the other. I really resonated with that when you said it in the moment, because it could be either or, right? That itself is a paradox. And we have many philosophical schools or thinkers in our current time who want to take one approach versus the other. It's either realism, where when we get too attached to that, we have materialism. And on the other side, we have the Maya hypothesis, where it's idealism. And it reflects the cultural and political landscape we are in today, where we're very polarized in this. And somehow there is a mystical union of these two, which I think, as you allude to often in this, that how it actually reflects in how we live our life. And what I resonate with your spirit is that when we embody this paradox, we can really make a contribution as awakened beings in the world that we live in, rather than being in our room and doing our spiritual practice while the wars rage, right? So thank you for that. A related theme, I think this has been great. So a related theme that we can maybe I can check in with you here is one of ascent and descent. So this is a theme that's taught in every spiritual tradition. We have, through ascent, I understand we mean our aspiration to rise. And one way to look at descent is grace. And you talk about your book in that, on this theme of descent, that our spiritual journey is either at one part it's ascent and the other part it's descent. But you can even see ascent. If you didn't have grace, you would not even aspire to rise. So I wanted to check in with you about this theme. But another way that I've been connecting with this theme of the descent is reincarnation, in a way, not just the reincarnation after death, but this fully returning to the source, which happens spontaneously, perhaps, and then a re-embodiment. And each time that this re-embodiment happens, we are more joyful, we are more creative. And in my case, that, at least in one very powerful time, has taken the form of a near-death experience post a surgery. And I see that as descent. And this is also a theme that's become very common to the collective sphere, where NDE has become a common, thing that's discussed. So maybe we can dive into that a little bit.
Well, as you well aware, um, in some of the modern understanding that many spiritual teachers prefer to view this, that the concept of ascend and descend um, seems irrelevant, if not nonsensical, because awareness is all pervasive. So therefore, ascent and descent is being often marginalized in terms of what these two principal movements represent, and because it's seen as only with reference to the body. So in other words, it's only with reference to the local experience. However, this is where Tantra is effectively becomes the science. There are aspects in Tantra as a philosophy, but Tantra also has this aspect to it, which is intimately related and can be spoken of in terms of its sister science as the alchemy. So because the ascent and descent here, to begin with, is the expression of two principal movements, even that of breathing. The breathing itself is governed by the descending breath of the apana and the ascending breath of exhalation as prana. So this descending and ascending principal movements of vital air and pranic currents is what, in fact, the anatomy of breathing. But in terms of that metaphysical perspective of the descent and ascent, this can be applied directly with that very same understanding. So, and this is where we deal now with this very subtle changeability of roles and aspects as they begin to play and interact. I will try to elaborate this so it's more accessible without making it too, let's say, flat or simple, because some may jump into conclusions, but let me give it a attempt at speaking it in terms of the feminine and masculine qualities. So on one hand, the descent as the descent of grace exemplifies the quality of Shiva. So therefore, it's a masculine quality, the quality of the spirit. And the ascent of power, ascent of Shakti, is an expression of the utmost feminine. So this descent of grace and ascent of power is really where that dynamics of real awakening proper, can be spoken of and is spoken of. And this is a subject, a very important subject of the next book I'm working on, entirely dedicated to the Kundalini. Kundalini as a philosophy, Kundalini as a concept, as a term, cultural term, supported by clinical studies, and what it represents really in terms of what awakening, when we speak of awakening, really is, as opposed to mental shifts, some profound insights, plenty of aha moments. There is also the direct and visceral alchemical transmutation, transformation. And this transformation is inseparable from these two grand movements, the movement represented by that what otherwise represents the ultimate masculine, the power of the descent, of the power of the descent of grace. And it is immediately countered and in resonance, because that's what creates in the first place, that what prompts that response of the utmost feminine to rise. So, and yet at the very same time, the display of that is in reverse. So the descent of grace, though masculine as the expression of Shiva, expression of this, the descent of spirit, in itself is exemplified by the qualities which are uh, qualities that can be spoken of in terms of utmost qualities of the mother, the utmost qualities of the feminine in terms of its manifestation. Whereas the ascent, though it's the ultimate expression of the feminine power of Shakti, is accompanied by the warrior-like rise of consciousness where this changeability of roles taking place. Just as in terms of the internal anatomy, Kundalini, first in its dormant state, represents this in a state of homeostasis, represents these feminine qualities, whereas the spinal column and the sushumna, that central shaft, represents the masculine quality, that quality as the column, the quality of the verticality, represents these masculine qualities and the dwelling feminine qualities at the base of it. And yet these roles need to be changed. And this is the alchemy of the process, because in order for the awakening to really bear fruits, for it to really come up with goods, as it were, Kundalini needs to traverse that rise through the Sushumna. So Kundalini becomes erect, and the tradition speaks about it as fully awakened Kundalini literally represents that erected like a stiff, like a staff, stiff, firm, because prior to that, it's in a state of that, let's say, I'm not in favor of it, but we will give it a concession and speak of it in that Indian traditional way of a serpent. Serpent who is in a state of dream, homeostasis, it's all soft and coiled and sort of like resembles a mass. Whereas the serpent that is fully risen stands as cobra, and it has this really vertical position. So at that moment, Kundalini is ready to enter Sushumna. So the gender, the divine gender here is now reversed. So Kundalini now begin to embody masculine qualities, and the Sushumna becomes that what is being penetrated. You see? So what prior to that was manifesting as and displaying itself as the quality of vertical dimension of that, what here the Sushumna represents prior to that, is now changed the roles. It dilates. You see? It has to open up. Literally, this is the divine cosmic coetus. This is the reunion begins to take place. So the Sushumna dilates and becomes as a feminine in its connotations, literally. It opens up as a vulva, where the erected Kundalini, which prior to that represented feminine, becomes the embodiment of masculine. And the alchemy proceeds from there and then. So the descent and ascent has these qualities of changeability or interchangeability of that divine gender-like qualities that they display. And when we speak about this, we should, of course, bring this to very important understanding that descent of grace is what brings the power to rise, and it is proportionate. It is equivalent. So the stronger is the Shakti part, the stronger is the power of rising. And once that ascent is complete, once that ascent is fully complete, then after a repose, and this is again the beauty of that spiritual anatomy, of that esoteric anatomy that Tantra operates with, just as upon creation of this, upon manifestation, consciousness reposes as Kundalini at the lower chambers. It, as it were, reached the ultimate state of manifestation, whereby the power of self-transformation, awareness can be experienced as individual. And Kundalini is that what checks that experience of an individual. When that reverse journey begins and culminates in full ascent, it then also reposes. But it reposes at the opposite pole of that, what was prior to that, a repose in a state of slumber. And upon that repose, it begins its descent. It begins its descent. So that is the final descent. This is the final descent. This is what Sri Aurobindo talked about as divinization of matter. This is where the body becomes divinized. This is where every experience is then becomes the conformation of unity. If prior to that every experience was the fragmentation and driven by the fragmentation, now that very same experience is the reconformation of unity. So it's not just to be taken at a face value as a mental concept, what we spoke at the earlier part of our conversation, that every experience is in fact divine at a given. But now we speak about it, it is divine now, not just because it's divine in principle, it is divine in terms of its actuality. So, and this is why Adi Shankara's final sadhana and final work, right? The Sri Sundarya Lahari, the poetic invocation of Shakti, is known as the descent or the great descent, because it speaks to that. It speaks to the power of Shakti now reclaiming all the world. And it is reclaiming it through the invocation of what this now the sage sings the glory. So there is analogy, direct analogy between the sages. The sage who lived in the 8th century as Adi Shankara, who is by daylight was known as the most lucid expound of Advaita Vedanta, but by every sunset, he was a Tantrika. He was the worshipper of Shakti. And another sage who lived at the beginning of the 20th century, some 12 centuries after, Sri Aurobindo, who in also his final work, Savitri, also sings hymn to Shakti. And all this, the conversation, right, that the revelations that Savitri experiences, right? Savitri and Savitri, how all this union, how that realization is then viscerally displayed and elaborated through the analogy of now how it gives that maybe stage by stage experience of complete and utter withdrawal, the samadhi, and how that upon that, it's then once it tasted that samadhi, once it experienced that complete and utter absorption, it then asks itself, it checks everything and finds that, hang on a second, well, there is some separation because I'm separate from the world of the phenomenal experience. And so the descent begins now, so that it's now need to be reclaimed, and the final gap is being bridged. So these two sages standing apart 1,000 years more plus speak to the same process, the process of the descent. And this is what Sri Aurobindo's work, in a way, why it's also, I feel, important, because aside from the tremendous influence that Sri Aurobindo as a philosopher sage, in terms of rehabilitation of the Vedas, and purely from that point of view, he was the first real, well, who called to question the entire premises of Indology, how Indology was studied, and how the Vedas were viewed as scattered, independent from each other, poetic expressions of this, of that age. He argued against that understanding, against that treatment, that the Vedas are in fact not just some collection of lore of this civilization, but it's an expression of the divine orchestration, and all of the Vedas are interconnected. And I wanted to maybe go back to that ascent versus descent, and how this potentially is often dismissed in a lot of spiritual conversation, because the emphasis is always on, well, awareness is omnipresent, it's all pervasive, it's all there is. And so the reference point of a body, often given it as a kind of not just peripheral affair, but often insignificant, let's say, obscure experience, because the senses here and the mind and all these instrumentalities rob us of who we are. But you see, that in itself is a very, very potentially erroneous understanding, because the body as a reference point precisely where everything taking place, and all our experiences are happening in and around the body. So therefore, for example, going back to when Muktananda was doing his work, and when he was rehabilitating uh, the notion of mind, which was attacked a lot by spiritual teachers of his time, he simply stated, if not for the mind, there'll be no self-realization, no concept of self-realization. So the mind here is that as the moon, which reflects the light of the sun, and it has this soothing rays. It literally bounces off its surface. And so the moonlight, this is where the poetry of life. So before we debase the mind, we need to understand that even Adi Shankara, who, as was mentioned, was unapologetic when it came to the crystal clear discourses of his Advaitic expositions, Advaitic Vedantic expositions, he also was very clear in terms of, ultimately speaking, everything here is to bathe in the rays of the moon. So the alchemy of yoga is to be able to drink that soma, that lunar quality, that what oozes out of our own internal anatomy, as those soothing moon rays, moonlight, and that what confers the sense of immortality amidst mundane experiences. And that what also unites a simple folk and the highest sage in a sense and in terms of that what is then available to savor. To savor. For the sage, it is continued reflection, continued reflection through the surface of that stilled mind, which reflects awareness now through the soothing rays and propagates the entire body. So this is, I feel, also an important contribution to the spiritual discussion, spiritual dialogues out there, and in terms of the what is the reference point and the importance of the reference point, because the body here is not, somebody who is declaring that I'm not the body, I'm I'm I've known myself to be beyond the body. Everything boils back to that what we experience here, whilst life force is in the body. So I just thought to bring that as a kind of a conclusive remark to that ascent and descent.
Yeah, thank you, Igor, for going so deeply and with such great clarity into this theme. Because, and I really wish that the listeners will be able to see the comprehensive and holistic nature of all that you're sharing. And Chamatkara is available to, if they wanted to um, go in a paced manner. So many themes you have shared with us in this theme, overarching theme of ascent and descent. And I have some reflections in my own sort of path, in the Advaita, Vedanta, or non-dual circles. At times, of course, Adi Shankara is considered the apostle, and often the name of Ramana Maharishi is used. And one of the themes that really became peculiar to me early on, I had an attraction at some level to devotional quality, somewhat, although my intellect was always very strong and I had a long-standing background in academia, which I have left for the past couple of years. Um, but devotion was considered like a bad thing, and I kept on getting deeper and deeper into that. And what also did not make sense to me is that um, this devotional quality, as you were saying, with the descent of the act of worship in Adi Shankara, and you mentioned Sundariya Lahari, which I haven't read, but my understanding is it almost looks like a tantric text. And Ramana Maharishi himself has devotional hymns to Arunachala. So this quality that you were alluding to is there. And I've begun to feel now that even in the Western non-dual circles, there is perhaps, and I say that with humility, an element of colonial impact where a more holistic view has been colonized and there's reductionism to reduce it. And yeah, I've that has sort of become more clear to me that that might be happening. So it is interesting because at so many levels, I come from the India, Pakistan, Kashmir region, and in my own life journey, I feel like there are so many steps we have to take to decolonize. It's so insidious and invisible. Um, uh, and you in your other videos you speak about that, and I'm so appreciative of that. And this perhaps to connect us with Sri Aurobindo's work, which has also been very meaningful to me. I've had a few conversations with Debashish Banerjee and the California Institute of Integral Sciences, where his work is really valued, in particular with our role as awakened human beings in the world. What is our role? And I think Sri Aurobindo's work really empowers. I felt an empowerment to to find that there is value in doing that. And I don't know if you had any comments, but another reflection I had was the whole ascent and descent process that you described seems to me to be connected with the concept of this elusive spanda in the Kashmir Shaivistic tradition. Would you say that there is a that ascent and descent is a description of spanda?
Can you maybe connect this together a little bit more? I understand where you come from in terms of why you brought Spanda now, as you spoke to Sri Aurobindo, and just so that I can see where you're coming from.
Yes. Well, for one reason, I know that Spanda is a mysterious subject, and I felt that your description was very apt. It uniquely describes that process, at least in my mind, because often I try to grapple and understand what Spanda is, and in my own understanding, that process of ascent and descent seems to encapsulate that idea. So maybe I'm also just checking if I need course correction there.
I see. Well, since we've allowed that use of genderization, which tradition freely utilizes, it would also be helpful to bring this maybe distinction that various tantras of what the non-dual tantra of Tantric Shaivism is known for. There are, although these are monistic tradition, this is a monistic tradition, and within that monistic tradition, there are different schools. So there are different schools. We can just mention for general interest of the listener, the most known of them are the Pratyabhijna, Spanda, and Krama. Respectively, they are Pratyabhijna as that direct recognition. We could correlate that to how it is today referred to the direct path, but I would not do that as direct analogy, simply to position the listener, because it's much more, I would say, nuanced and sophisticated. And Spanda, which stands uniquely between the Pratyabhijna and the Krama school. And the Krama school is the school which exalts progressive unfoldment. Krama literally means in succession, in sequence, in stages. So we have here direct versus progressive paths. So what makes Spanda unique is that with Pratyabhijna there is a clear goal, and therefore it representative here of that masculine quality of Shiva. So before maybe we continue, it would be helpful to bring this as a reminder that although monistic in essence, some of the expounding sages of Tantric Shaivism were gravitating more towards that Shiva-based perspective, whilst others were gravitating towards Shakta-based perspective. There is absolutely no contradiction between the two. And very often the disciple of one master who may be exalting the path of Shiva would actually gravitate towards more of that where the primacy is Shakti, simply because the Shiva-Shakti union, the dyadic relationship here is exemplified in that infinity here. Shiva is Shakti and Shakti is Shiva. The one is two and two is one, or one in two and two in one. So therefore, there is no contradiction. It's a simply a certain distinctive standpoint taken. So the Pratyabhijna school, the school of direct recognition, is more of that, what exemplifies these masculine qualities, whereas Spanda represents more of that feminine quality. In other words, more Shakti oriented. And the Spanda here is not the goal. In Pratyabhijna, the goal is Shiva, the goal is self-realization. The goal is to realize that this Jiva is indeed Shiva, is to realize that this individual consciousness is universal consciousness. First, to realize that this individual consciousness is identical with universal consciousness, and then to realize that all there is universal consciousness. So therefore, individual consciousness is universal consciousness in disguise. So there are stages in that realization. But there is a goal. This goal is exemplified in Shiva. Whereas in Spanda, there is no goal. There is no goal as such. Spanda emphasizes simply tapping to that what is here available through myriad of experience throughout, be they aesthetic in nature or joltingly in response to the outer stimuli. Let's say when we bear witness to some display of the power of nature, earthquake, a powerful storm, extraordinary sight, or as the scriptures go to describe sometimes the most mundane experience when we get up from a daily nap and suddenly we don't know what to do, not because of the boredom, simply we catch ourselves in that moment of we don't know whether we're coming or going. We simply find ourselves in that sudden gap where there is no propensity to remain, no propensity to go. And this is where one directly, as the scriptures say, savors Spanda. One tastes Spanda. Spanda here stands for that throb, that quiver. It's some form of movement, but it's not movement in the sense of how we speak of movement in a physical sense, because that quiver is at the heart of awareness itself. So, and of course, the teaching of Spanda is proceeds from this understanding that amidst the vastness of the expansion, there is contraction. And at the heart of every contraction, there is expansion. So that concept of the yin-yang as one contains the other. So in other words, every experience contains its opposite, diametrically opposite. So, and this understanding that there is this continued waves, myriad of waves that ebb and flow as they crash at the shore of existence and back to the heart where these waves emanate from. So this myriad of waves run into each other. And that's what creates that shimmering field or shimmering ocean of sound, vibrations, that shimmering pool of light and sound. So that Spanda here is found on that what expands and contracts continuously. So this understanding here is what the goal in the Pratyabhijna is to realize the identity with Shiva. Whereas in Spanda is simply to realize that this experience of Spanda as the doctrine of vibration exalts is what gives us direct taste of our essence. You see, so that there is a subtlety, and in a way, it's a distinctively unique way of within the tradition. And I personally always felt great affinity with that because it also brought this plenty of reminders of how that was already known prior to anything. When we realize the essence of who we are, when that realization, when that cognition takes place, it's on par with remembrance and remembrance only. And that remembrance is not in terms of seeing something new for the first time, is to recognizing that what we are. So this is what also Spanda here represents. So it can be invoked, and with enough, let's say, attention, because it's all at the quality of the attention. One can find oneself in Spanda at will, eventually, amidst any experience. Any experience. This will be on par with the Zen stories of a frog leaping to a pond leads to the realization of that particular master. Not the discourse, not the zazen, not the years of study. Simply something unrelated brings this direct cognition of the essence. The Zen is full of these stories, right? So it's like the giving that poetic allusions. But we could speak about that. Analogy is in Spanda.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I also feel like I've developed an affinity for that because that sort of goallessness that you speak of, I feel once you quote unquote transcend, you end up back here. And so then what's the point of transcending if you keep returning to creation? That's sort of my interpretation of my inner reality and just being more and more relaxed to that there is no goal to seek. And it's also paradoxical because that throws you more into this cosmic exploration and living life as fully as you can. Doesn't seem to eradicate pain and discipline and hard work, but but yeah, that's part of it, and that also gives joy. So thank you for for making that more clear. Maybe to an earlier theme that I didn't question that I posed to you but didn't pose it correctly. Maybe to reflect together on is do you think that part of uh, the dismissal and seeking a goal, particularly in non-duality, has some reductionistic or aspects of colonialism, which is just endemic in our collective civilization? Um, it's, at least to me, it's becoming a little bit more clear. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on that?
Well,
Put you on the spot.
I am sure you are aware and how much I have spoken about this. So this is why I'm posing, so as not to repeat myself and
Yes, you have.
not to follow into kind of like a certain patterns. And I don't want to start sounding like uh, speaking from that place of um, constant critical assessment. But there is definitely something to that what could be spoken of as um, the remnants of intellectual imperialism, uh, which is the inheritance of the colonialism per se, but it is much less detectable when it comes to the domain of cultural enterprise, because it's not very, very clear where and how certain uniquely, let's say, unique expressions of how consciousness expressed itself in a particular way in a given moment in time, in a certain culture, through certain culture, is being then interpreted by some of the, let's say, those who feel they are in a position, and they are well, have the right platform to speak on behalf of these traditions. We know this poses big problems today because at the very same time, this has been acknowledged, so that there are lots of new, there's a whole pleiad of younger generation of scholars growing within respective traditions where they see this as their responsibility to rehabilitate the traditions into which they feel they are belonging to, even through that kind of DNA connection, cultural connection, to free it from these colonial interpretations, these attempts at categorizing. This is what I've referred to when speaking of Sri Aurobindo's great input, is to question the Indology as a science. And we know that happened within the traditions itself. We know that there were exemplars of those who have been initiates into respective traditions to such degree that they became the embodiments of that tradition, even though they came from outside of the cultures, or born outside of the cultures. Those rare examples, of course, they rather confirm the rule rather than defy them. And this can be observed, that tendency also, the tendency to simplify and to strip traditional approaches and understanding to what would, effectively speaking, adhere only to one aspect and mental, let's say, sphere, is where the Western, where we can speak about it endemically, to understand everything in very rational, direct terms. So these attempts were done constantly by scholars and by practitioners, and also by the army of seekers who are out there to shortcut straight to the cherry picking of what tradition may be offering here, because they feel they're privy to that, because somehow we live in time, in a day and age, when this is granted. If I'm born into a middle class, relatively comfortable setting where life affords the possibility of this spiritual seeking, then naturally, why would I question my the legitimacy of being given access? And I'm now speaking about it, including myself here. So it's not I'm speaking about it exclusively. It is a phenomena. It is a phenomena that today we can study and partake in anything we want. We can change costumes. We can change costumes as easily as we decide what we want to enjoy for a supper. Do we want to have a Japanese, or do we want to have Indian? Do we want to have Italian? So this also is part of the cosmopolitan aspect of life today, affords this possibility. So now, perhaps more than ever before, right? Like I travel in Europe, and so you could have great ramen in Vienna, in Zurich, you can have great ramen in any European city, and have certainly Vietnamese, Singaporean, like any variety of Asian food. So why would that be restricted to food alone? So of course, this is opened to all that what goes for mental nourishment. The problem comes here, of course, with food. It can be prepared authentically. Maybe not as authentically as the true art of noodles making, even based on Miyazaki films, the anime, the great, how he portrays that nostalgia of the days gone by, how these noodles were prepared in his own little hometown when he grew up. I'm talking about the great Japanese anime maker, Miyazaki. The quality of water, the quality of wheat, and how it is done by hand. I grew up in Uzbekistan, as you know. So, I mean, there's a great, very rich cuisine which incorporated into itself, being heirs to the Silk Road. There are so many influences that have been incorporated into its own cuisine: Iranian, North Chinese, Dungan, Uyghur, Manchurian, Mongolian, Russian, so many different influences that have been incorporated. So, of course, when it comes to food, we can enjoy that meal in a much more authentic way. When it comes to the spiritual nourishment, this is not as straightforward. Simply because already the propensity is to withdraw, remove. I don't want to use the word castrate because it maybe sound unpleasant here in the metaphorical sense even, but sanitized maybe from aspects that seem to feel less palatable to my desire to get to the point. And in fact, get to the point, I often hear from those who follow a YouTube channel, people who want to have a rational explanation. Why to beat about the bush? Get us the straight answer. You see, so this is where it makes me wonder if this is indeed on a level of some kind of psychological impediment, that we want to have a quick, instantly made meal, and we want it to be nourishing. But it is not nourishing. And if we're honest, because it's instant, it's made out of the packet, often prepared already. So that engagement at that level is already bereft of a lot of factors. So of course, the steeped in the butter of, fried in the butter of knowledge, steeped in the honey of love, as Paramahamsa Ramakrishna exclaimed, is not necessarily always is the case. But this is very, very important, indispensable part of all Oriental traditions, that where the aspect of devotion is accompanied the highest understanding. So devotion itself here is not some soapy, over emotionality. Devotion here is, in fact, a sign of a highly refined heart. Devotion is the quality of the heart. And it comes out of tremendous discipline as well, commitment, and combined with all these other qualities of acceptance, surrender, then it really becomes a tremendous force. So I don't know. I'm the last person to really to speak about this in a sense because um, I have given so much attention and time, particularly in the earlier years, in terms of that propensity for sterilizing the teaching, stripping it bare of any nuances, where the teachings then seems to be palatable to the tongue of the consumer who wants to have an instant access, is detrimental in the long run, even detrimental there and then, because it gives one a false sense of authenticity of one's own experiences. You see, it often reconfirms that what actually meant to still be cooked. It reconfirms that what is now being in the boiling pot is ready. As Rumi explains, no, back to that chickpea that jumps out of the pot, you're too hard, you're too crunchy, back into the pot, you know? You cannot be made into a nice kind of like, offering, sweet and tender and soft and juicy, it needs to be still given that. So yes, it's hopefully that kind of insight is there in someone who has been around the block, realizes that, well, no shortcut would do. In fact, there's no shortcuts per se. They are supplements, like something that pretends to be, and then when it is consumed, it leaves us undernourished. See?
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you. And I think you have spoken about it, and it's quite amazing that you were speaking about it more than a decade ago almost. And I think the field has started to shift quite a bit now
Yes,
in a good
definitely.
way.
Yeah, there
Yeah.
is a greater propensity for. I can see that even in some of the teachers, like real key, um, great teachers, by the way, who have mellowed and allowed much more uh, apologetic approaches in the responses and the engagement, and there's less radicalism, and there's a less as a result of that dismissal. So that definitely the climate is changing. So hopefully
Yeah.
that also brings this. What also very encouraging is that young generation, and we started having these waves of very young people into the work, and they're amazing. You know, they don't come for shortcuts. These guys, they just like they. I'm never really cease to be amazed each time I meet and sit in front of this just barely 20 something, and the quality of the inquiry and and the readiness and is there. It's like, it's much more inspiring than than being around the jaded seeker who just begs for final answer because it's tiring to seek, you see.
Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah, it's reflective of, as I have been studying the wider culture, and you give so many analogies of simplicity, and in the academic circles, materialism itself is a is a form of reductionism, right? And it just sometimes reductionism is good if you're just using it as a tool to study. It simplifies things, but if you just stick to that, then it's a form of rejection of what reality is. And during the conversation, I think, as you were alluding to, the tantric path, that it's not one of rejecting creation. And yeah, so thank you for that. Thank you so much, Igor, for being with me. You've given so much time and energy today. So grateful. And once again, your retreats are coming up. You're coming here to the US in September and October.
Great. Well, continue beautiful work.
Yeah.
Continue. Might be blessed, might be successful. It's really, really great to see you doing this.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for empowering me. I really feel it.
Sometimes we need that encouragement, and that encouragement can come in many ways, but there is something to be said also how that passage, rites of passage, is, that carrying the divine masculine in the body, the only when we become of service, we truly resolve this um, nitpicking kind of self-centric um, circumambulating our own belly button with our problems, that it's a waste of time. Once something is given towards worthwhile cause, this is where the prana flows, where the force goes. And we then are given that as well. So may that force be with you.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Hello, friends. Thank you for watching this episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. So I wanted to quickly tell you a little bit about Potential Paradigms. We at Potential Paradigms are now a team of 4 people, and this is a labor of love. This is not how we support our life or our livelihood, but we love to do this work and share information about new paradigms and new ways of being for everybody so that we can have a new world which is for the well-being of all. So if you'd like to support us so that we can continue to do our work, there's a link for a tip jar above and in the show notes below. So feel free to exercise your generosity. It is much appreciated. Thank you.